34 pickup trucks lined the dirt road before sunrise. Some belonged to farmers, some belonged to equipment dealers. A few belonged to people who had simply heard the rumor and driven out to see it for themselves. Nobody had come to help. They had come to watch. And most of them had come to laugh. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No seed trucks, no fertilizer tanks, no workers preparing fields. Only one old tractor moving slowly across 30 acres of perfectly good farmland. Its headlights cut through the gray Oklahoma dawn like two tired eyes refusing to close. At the wheel sat Malcolm Reed, 61 years old, third-generation farmer, hands permanently stained by soil and engine grease, the kind of man who spoke so little that some people mistook it for weakness. The tractor wasn't planting. It wasn't fertilizing, it wasn't cultivating, it was flattening the soil, again, and again, and again. As if Malcolm had decided to erase 30 acres from existence. A laugh erupted near the fence line. Then another. Soon half a dozen voices joined in. Curtis Freeman stood with his arms crossed beside a shiny black pickup truck, worth more than many people's homes. For 25 years he had been the largest agricultural supplier in the county. If a farmer needed seed, fertilizer, chemicals, irrigation equipment, or financing, Curtis was usually involved somewhere in the process. People listened when he spoke, and Curtis was smiling. Looks like old Malcolm finally lost his mind. Several men chuckled. One farmer shook his head. Prices are the highest they've been in years. Another added, and he's leaving 30 acres empty. Curtis spat into the dust. Not empty, worse. He paid money to make it empty. The crowd laughed harder. Across the road Malcolm never looked up. The tractor continued moving, slow, steady, unbothered. That somehow made the laughter even louder. Because people can tolerate mistakes. What they struggle to tolerate is confidence they don't understand. 300 yards away, standing beside an old grain shed, Andre Reed watched the scene unfold. 28 years old. Lean build, dark hoodie, work boots coated in red Oklahoma dirt. A faded brown notebook rested under his arm. The same notebook he carried everywhere. Most of the county thought he was responsible for whatever madness was happening. They weren't wrong. 6 months earlier, Andre had returned home after spending nearly 5 years working with soil conservation programs across several states. His job had involved something most local farmers never thought about. What happened beneath the ground? Not crops, not markets, not equipment, the dirt itself. And what he discovered after returning home had kept him awake for weeks. The problem wasn't visible from the surface. The wheat looked healthy, the yields looked acceptable, the books still balanced. But beneath the first few inches of soil the farm was changing. Slowly, dangerously, and almost nobody noticed, including Malcolm, at first. Andre remembered the night he brought the reports to the kitchen. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside Malcolm's plate. The old man had spent 14 hours repairing a combine and looked ready to fall asleep where he sat. Andre spread several pages across the table. Soil density tests. Malcolm nodded. Looks expensive. It'll be more expensive if we ignore it. That earned a glance. Andre pointed at the charts. Years of continuous planting, years of heavy machinery, years of squeezing production from the same ground. The soil was becoming compacted. Less oxygen, less water retention, lower biological activity. The decline was slow enough to hide from yearly reports, but fast enough to destroy the farm over the next decade. Malcolm studied the papers for several minutes, then asked a question that surprised Andre. What would your grandfather do? Andre looked down. The question wasn't really about farming. It never was. His grandfather had built the farm. His father had expanded it. Now the responsibility sat between them like an uninvited guest. Andre answered carefully. Granddad listened when the land started talking. Silence filled the kitchen. Only rain, only the ticking wall clock, only the hum of the refrigerator. Then Malcolm leaned back. What are you asking me to do? Andre hesitated, because he already knew how ridiculous it sounded. Leave 30 acres alone. The room became very still. Even Evelyn stopped washing dishes. Leave it alone? Andre nodded. No planting, no harvesting, no revenue, one season. Malcolm stared at him, then laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. For nearly 80 years nobody in the Reed family had willingly left productive land untouched. Not during droughts, not during recessions, not during market crashes. Certainly not during record commodity prices. Yet Andre kept talking, explaining cover crops, moisture recovery, microbial restoration, soil structure, long-term resilience. The science made sense. The economics did not, at least not immediately, which was exactly why everyone else would hate the idea, including Curtis Freeman. Especially Curtis Freeman. 2 weeks later the annual county agriculture meeting took place inside an aging community center. Nearly every major farmer attended. So did suppliers, bankers, equipment dealers, insurance agents. Curtis sat in the front row, Andre sat in the back. When the discussion turned toward next season's planting plans, someone casually asked Malcolm what he intended to do with the western section of his property. Malcolm looked toward his son. Just briefly. Then answered, "We're letting 30 acres rest." The room erupted. Not violently, not angrily. The way people react when they think they've heard a joke. Curtis laughed first, others followed. Questions flew from every direction. Why? For how long? Are you sick? Did you lose financing? Are you selling? Malcolm said almost nothing. Andre finally stood and tried explaining. The science, the risks, the warning signs, the future. Nobody cared. Because the future always sounds ridiculous when the present still appears comfortable. Curtis waited until Andre finished. Then delivered the line everyone would remember. "Son, fields aren't classrooms. They don't give extra credit for creativity." The room exploded with laughter. Andre felt heat rise into his face. Not anger. Something heavier. The realization that facts alone rarely change minds. Especially when those minds have been rewarded for thinking the same way for 30 years. The meeting moved on. The laughter faded. People went home. But something happened that night. Something nobody else knew. Back at the farm, unable to sleep, Andre opened his laptop one more time. He pulled up updated groundwater measurements from 3 monitoring stations across the county. Then compared them with historical drought patterns. His eyes narrowed. He checked again, then again. For almost an hour he sat motionless. The numbers weren't supposed to line up this way, but they did, every single one. Slowly, Andre reached for the brown notebook, the one he carried everywhere, the one filled with observations nobody else cared about. He opened to a blank page and wrote 5 words. If this model is right. Then he stopped. Because the next prediction sounded insane. Far more insane than leaving 30 acres empty. Outside the window, lightning flickered across the distant Oklahoma horizon. No thunder followed. Not yet. Andre stared at the numbers, then whispered something nobody else heard. The rain is about to disappear. And for the first time in his life, he hoped he was wrong. The first well went dry on June 11. Nobody panicked. Not at first. The Miller family farm sat 12 miles south of the Reed property, and shallow wells failed from time to time during hot summers. Most years it meant a pump repair, a clogged line, or bad luck. People shrugged and moved on. 3 days later, a second well stopped producing, then another, then another. The conversations at diners and feed stores changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of change you notice when laughter becomes shorter. When people stop finishing their coffee. When weather reports suddenly matter more than baseball scores. Yet the sky remained empty. Every morning began with hope. Every evening ended with dust. Across the county, wheat fields still looked respectable from the highway. That was the dangerous part. From a distance, everything appeared normal. The real story lived beneath the surface. Roots searching for moisture. Soil losing structure. Plants spending more energy surviving than growing. Most people couldn't see it. Andre could. Every evening he walked the Reed property carrying the same faded notebook. He checked moisture sensors, recorded temperatures, measured soil density, took photographs from the same locations. Sometimes Malcolm followed him, usually in silence. One evening they stopped beside the 30-acre field. The abandoned field, the field everyone mocked. Nothing there looked impressive. No cash crop, no harvest waiting. Only a carefully planted mixture of cover vegetation that most people would have called weeds. Low-growing plants. Wild-looking patches of green. A strange sight in a county obsessed with production. Malcolm kicked at the dirt with his boot. "What do you see?" Andre crouched, scooped up a handful of soil, then handed it to his father. Malcolm squeezed it. The soil held together. Not tightly, not loosely, just enough, like a sponge. Now Andre pointed toward one of their neighboring fields. The difference was subtle, but once seen, impossible to ignore. The neighboring soil looked harder, drier, more compacted. Malcolm said nothing. Neither man needed to. The land was already speaking. A week later, Curtis Freeman hosted a customer appreciation lunch at his equipment dealership. Free hamburgers, cold drinks, discount offers. Half the county showed up. Farmers needed reasons to feel optimistic. Curtis understood that. Business depended on optimism. Near noon, someone brought up Malcolm Reed's empty field again. The laughter returned immediately. Curtis leaned against a shiny irrigation display. "You know what the problem is?" Several people looked over. "College." A few chuckles followed. Curtis continued. "Every generation gets convinced they've discovered something their grandparents somehow missed." More laughter. Someone pointed toward Andre standing near the edge of the crowd. "Like him?" Curtis smiled. "Especially like him." Most people laughed. But not everyone. Because something had changed over the previous week. The weather forecast. Meteorologists were beginning to use words they hadn't used earlier in the year. Persistented, concerning, below average. Nobody liked hearing those words, especially in Oklahoma. Especially in June. Andre walked away from the conversation. Not because he was offended, because he was worried. The latest groundwater report had arrived that morning. The numbers were worse, far worse. That night he spread maps across the kitchen table, colored charts, monitoring data. Rainfall comparisons going back 20 years. Malcolm studied them quietly. Evelyn poured coffee. Nobody touched it. What are the chances? Malcolm finally asked. Andre hesitated. He hated certainty. Nature punished certainty. But the evidence kept pointing in the same direction. High, how high? Andre looked down. Then back up. High enough that we need to prepare. The room fell silent. Outside, wind rattled metal siding on the equipment shed. Inside, the old refrigerator hummed. Small sounds suddenly felt loud. Malcolm stared at the maps for a long time. Then he stood, without another word, Raj, and returned carrying a worn metal box. Andre recognized it immediately, his grandfather's box. Old property records, farm journals, yield reports, handwritten notes dating back decades. Malcolm placed it on the table. Your grandfather kept records of every drought he ever saw. Andre opened it. The paper smelled old, dusty, familiar. Together they spent hours reading year after year, observation after observation. Then Andre froze. One page, one sentence, written decades earlier by a man who had never attended college, a man who had never seen satellite data, a man who had never used a computer. The note read, when the shallow wells begin failing before July, expect trouble. Andre read it twice. Then a third time. Malcolm noticed. What is it? Andre slowly turned the notebook around. The old farmer's words sat there in faded blue ink. Written nearly half a century earlier. Malcolm stared at them. Neither man spoke. Because sometimes science and experience arrive at the same destination using different roads. The next morning the county received official notice. A regional drought watch? Not a drought emergency. Not yet. But close enough. News spread fast. People became uneasy. Curtis publicly dismissed it. It's Oklahoma. We've had dry summers before. Many wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier. Then July arrived. And the rain never came, not one meaningful storm.
Clouds formed.
Then disappeared. Thunder rolled in distant counties, then faded. Weather apps promised relief. Relief never arrived, day after day, week after week. The fields began changing. The wheat lost some color. Then more. Leaves curled. Growth slowed. Farmers stopped talking about yields. They started talking about survival. One afternoon, state hydrologist appeared on local television. Most people watched while eating dinner, others watched from tractors. Some listened on radios. The expert stood before a large map. His expression looked grim. Behind him, colored zones covered western Oklahoma. Red, orange, dark red. Then he spoke. The drought models had been updated. Groundwater depletion was accelerating. The region faced the most severe moisture deficit in nearly 15 years. Several farmers dropped their forks. Several more turned up the volume. Then came the sentence nobody expected. The warning signs were visible months ago. Andre sat frozen, because he already knew what came next. The expert pointed toward a chart, one nearly identical to the chart sitting in Andre's notebook. The same pattern, the same trend, the same conclusion. Everything Andre had predicted months earlier. Everything people had laughed at. Everything Curtis Freeman had mocked in front of half the county. It was all there, publicly confirmed, by the state. Evelyn slowly lowered the remote. Malcolm looked toward his son. Neither smiled. There was no victory in being right. Not when being right meant disaster was coming. Outside, darkness settled over the farm. The abandoned 30-acre field moved gently in the evening wind. Still green, still alive, still absorbing moisture, still ignored by most people, but not for much longer. Because 40 miles away, at a monitoring station near the state line, a technician had just recorded a number so alarming that emergency calls were already beginning. And by sunrise, the entire county would learn something far worse than a drought was unfolding. Something that could threaten every farm in the region. Every farm except one. And nobody yet understood why. The first farm auction happened on a Thursday. That was when people finally stopped pretending. For months, the county had been speaking the language of hope. Maybe next week, maybe the forecast changes, maybe August brings rain. Hope sounds noble until bills arrive, then it becomes arithmetic. A faded sign appeared beside County Road 18. Farm liquidation. Everything must go. Tractors, tools, livestock. A lifetime reduced to a date and a starting bid. By the following week there were 3 more signs, then 6, then 10. The drought was no longer a weather problem. It had become a financial one. And financial problems move faster than storms. At Curtis Freeman's dealership, the atmosphere had changed completely. The showroom remained spotless. The machines remained polished. The fluorescent lights still glowed above rows of expensive equipment. But customers weren't buying. They were calculating. One afternoon, Curtis watched a farmer cancel a financing agreement he'd spent 6 months negotiating. An hour later, another customer postponed a purchase. By closing time, 3 separate families had informed him they were selling cattle. Nobody mentioned expansion anymore. Nobody talked about next season. People were trying to survive this one. Curtis sat alone in his office after dark. The dealership parking lot looked unusually empty. His desk was covered with unpaid invoices. A half-eaten sandwich sat beside his coffee. The coffee had gone cold hours earlier. For the first time in years, he found himself staring through the window toward the horizon, toward the Reed farm, toward those 30 acres. The same 30 acres he had laughed at. He hated that thought, so he pushed it away. Meanwhile, across the county, something strange was happening beneath the soil. Not everywhere, only on one farm. Andre noticed it first during a routine moisture inspection. The readings made no sense. He checked the equipment, then checked again, then replaced the sensor entirely. The numbers remained the same. The restored field was holding significantly more moisture than neighboring land. Not a little more, a lot more. Enough to matter, enough to change outcomes, enough to save crops. Andre sat inside the pickup for nearly 20 minutes studying the readings. The brown notebook lay open beside him. Page after page of observations. Months of measurements, years of education. Yet even he struggled to believe what he was seeing. That evening he showed the data to Malcolm. The old farmer remained quiet. He always became quieter when situations grew serious. "What does it mean?" Malcolm finally asked. Andre rubbed his eyes. "It means the field is recovering faster than expected." "How much faster?" Andre paused, then answered honestly. "Enough that I don't understand it yet." That answered Malcolm more than certainty ever could. Because Andre rarely admitted uncertainty. The next morning, a white state vehicle pulled into the Reed property. Then another, then a third. Neighbors immediately noticed. Small towns always notice. By noon, rumors were spreading through diners, gas stations, and church parking lots. Government inspectors, environmental violations, federal investigations, water restrictions. Nobody knew, everyone guessed. The truth was much stranger. A team from Oklahoma State University's Agricultural Research Department had requested access to the farm. Their lead researcher was Dr. Marcus Ellison, one of the most respected soil ecologists in the region. He arrived carrying equipment worth more than most cars. Sensors, sampling kits, portable scanners, drones. The team spent hours examining the 30-acre field. They dug holes, collected samples, recorded measurements, asked questions, then returned the next day and the day after that. By the third visit, the rumors had become impossible to ignore. Curtis finally drove out himself. He found Dr. Ellison kneeling beside a soil pit near the center of the field. "What exactly are you looking at?" The professor stood slowly, brushed dirt from his jeans, then pointed downward. "This," Curtis looked confused. "Dirt?" The professor smiled slightly. "Healthy dirt." Curtis frowned. Dr. Ellison continued. "Most people think soil is dead. It isn't, it's alive. Billions of microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, worms, roots, entire ecosystems." He pointed toward neighboring farmland. Years of continuous production can weaken that ecosystem. Then he pointed back to the restored field. "But this." He shook his head. "This is extraordinary." Curtis crossed his arms. What exactly is extraordinary? The answer hit harder than he expected. "The field is rebuilding itself." Curtis said nothing. The professor continued. "The cover vegetation reduced evaporation. The root systems improved structure. The microbial activity increased water retention. The soil is behaving more like a sponge." Then came the sentence that made Curtis uncomfortable. "Frankly, this may become one of the best case studies we've seen in years." For several seconds nobody spoke. The wind carried dust across nearby roads. Dust from failing fields. Dust from dying crops. Dust from farms that had spent decades chasing maximum production. And here stood a field that wasn't producing anything at all. Yet somehow it was becoming more valuable, not less. Curtis drove home unsettled. For the first time, doubt entered places certainty had occupied for decades. The drought continued. Temperatures climbed higher. Several reservoirs fell to critical levels. The county entered emergency conservation measures. Then another shock arrived. State crop reports were released. The numbers were devastating. Some operations had lost nearly half their expected yield. Others were facing total failure. Bankers began making difficult phone calls. Insurance adjusters became familiar faces, and every new report seemed worse than the one before. Yet on the Reed farm, something unexpected emerged. The fields bordering the restored acreage were outperforming similar land elsewhere. Not dramatically, not enough to make headlines, but enough to survive, enough to remain profitable, enough to stay alive. Andrei spent nights trying to understand why. Eventually the answer appeared, not in a laboratory, not in a satellite image, but inside his grandfather's old records. A forgotten journal entry, written nearly 40 years earlier, one paragraph, just 4 sentences. The old farmer had observed that fields resting near active production zones often seemed to help surrounding ground recover after dry years. At the time he lacked scientific proof, so nobody listened. Now modern data was suggesting he had been right all along. Andrei stared at the page, then looked toward the dark window. Outside, the 30-acre fields swam beneath moonlight, not abandoned, not wasted, not empty, working, quietly. The realization sent chills through him, because the field wasn't simply protecting itself, it was helping protect everything around it. 3 days later, Dr. Ellison called. His voice sounded unusually excited. "We finished the analysis." Andrei sat upright immediately. "What did you find?" There was a pause. Then the professor laughed softly, not a mocking laugh, a surprised one. "The 30-acre field isn't the story anymore." Andrei frowned. "What do you mean?" The professor took a breath. "The surrounding fields are changing too." Silence. Then another sentence. One that would soon shake the entire county. "Andrei, I think your father accidentally created something most farmers haven't seen in generations." Outside, thunder finally rolled across the horizon. But no rain followed, not a single drop. And by the time the county learned what Dr. Ellison had discovered, people would stop calling it the empty field. They would start calling it something else. The field that saved the farm. By September, people stopped asking whether the drought was serious. The question had become much simpler. Who would still be standing when it ended? The answer surprised almost everyone, including some of the people standing on the Reed farm that morning. More than 60 trucks lined the county road. Reporters, researchers, farmers, bank representatives, county officials. Most of them had come for the same reason. They wanted to see the field, not the famous wheat fields, not the profitable sections, not the machinery. The 30 acres, the same 30 acres that had once been called waste, the same 30 acres that had once been a joke. Now people walked through it carefully, almost respectfully, as if stepping into a place they didn't fully understand, because the numbers had finally become impossible to ignore. While farms across the county reported devastating losses, the Reed operation had remained stable. Not spectacular, not miraculous, stable. And during a disaster, stability looks like genius. Dr. Ellison stood beside a temporary presentation board near the edge of the field. Several local television stations had arrived. Farmers gathered around, many of them looked exhausted. Months of uncertainty had left its mark. Tired eyes, unshaven faces, shoulders carrying invisible weight. The professor pointed toward a series of charts. This field reduced surface moisture loss. He pointed to another graph. It improved infiltration, another. It increased biological activity. Then he paused, and perhaps most importantly, he looked across the crowd. It created resilience. The word hung in the air, resilience. Not maximum yield, not maximum profit, resilience, the ability to survive what nobody expected. Several farmers exchanged glances, because deep down they understood. Many had spent years optimizing for the perfect season. Very few had prepared for a bad one. Andrei stood quietly near the back. The attention made him uncomfortable. He had never wanted recognition. He had wanted time. Time for the land to recover. Time for people to listen. Time for the future to arrive before the damage became permanent. Now the future had arrived, and it wasn't pleasant. A reporter approached him. "What does it feel like proving everyone wrong?" Andrei stared at the field for a moment, then shook his head. "I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong." The reporter waited. Andrei continued. "I was trying to keep my family's farm alive." That answer made the evening news. Not because it was dramatic, because it sounded real. Later that week, harvest began. Across the county, combines moved through struggling fields. Many operators already knew the numbers would disappoint. Some simply wanted closure. Others needed documentation for insurance claims. The mood was grim. Until the first Reed farm reports arrived. The figures spread through the county faster than any official announcement. The Reed operation had not achieved the highest yields. Not even close. But they had generated the highest net income. The distinction mattered. Because profit isn't determined by how much you produce. It's determined by how much survives. The restored field had reduced losses, protected surrounding acreage, improved water retention, reduced input costs, and helped preserve productive capacity for future seasons. The farm didn't win because it produced more. It won because it lost less. That realization hit people harder than any drought statistic. A week later, Curtis Freeman drove out to the property again. This time he came alone, no customers, no audience, no speeches. The sun was setting when he arrived. Andre was repairing a section of fencing near the north boundary. The old hammer belonged to Malcolm's father. The wooden handle had been replaced twice. The head was worn smooth by decades of work. Another object carrying its own history. Curtis stepped out of his truck. For several moments neither man spoke. The wind moved through dry grass. Somewhere in the distance a gate creaked. Finally Curtis broke the silence. "You know." He stared toward the horizon. "I spent most of this year thinking you'd get proven wrong." Andre smiled faintly. "You weren't the only one." Curtis laughed. For once it wasn't an arrogant laugh. Just an honest one. "No, I wasn't." Another silence followed. Then Curtis surprised him. "I owe you an apology." Andre looked up. Curtis kept talking before he could respond. "I laughed. I encouraged other people to laugh. I convinced myself experience meant I couldn't learn anything from somebody younger." His voice softened. "Turns out experience can make a man blind if he's not careful." For a moment neither moved. Then Curtis extended his hand. Andre shook it. No dramatic music, no crowd, no speeches. Just two men standing beside a fence as the sun disappeared behind Oklahoma farmland. Sometimes that's what real endings look like. But the story wasn't quite over. 3 months later, Oklahoma State University published its findings. The Reed Farm project became one of the most discussed agricultural case studies in the region. Farmers began experimenting with recovery fields, cover crops, soil restoration practices, long-term moisture management, not because of government mandates, not because of regulations, because they had seen the results. One farm became 10, 10 became 50. Within a few years, practices once considered ridiculous had become increasingly common. The county changed slowly. The way meaningful change usually happens. One conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one field at a time. Then came the moment Malcolm never expected. The annual County Agriculture Conference, the largest gathering of producers in the region. Hundreds attended. Bankers, farm owners, students, equipment dealers. And for the first time in the event's history, the keynote speaker wasn't a politician, economist, or industry executive. It was Andre Reed. When his name was announced, Malcolm sat in the front row. Evelyn beside him. The old farmer wore the same jacket he had owned for nearly 20 years. The sleeves were slightly faded, the collar showed wear, but it was his favorite. Andre stepped onto the stage. For several seconds he simply looked at the audience. Then he opened the brown notebook. The same notebook he had carried through the entire drought. Pages filled with observations, mistakes, measurements, questions, lessons. The room became quiet. Andre looked down at one page, then spoke. When people tell this story they usually focus on the field. A few heads nodded. But the field isn't the lesson. Silence. The lesson is what happened before the field. The audience leaned forward. Andre continued. The lesson is that my father was willing to listen. He paused. He didn't fully agree. He wasn't completely convinced. He wasn't certain, but he listened. Malcolm lowered his eyes. The room remained silent. Andre looked toward the front row. Toward the man who had trusted him when trusting him carried risk. The 30 acres didn't save our farm. The audience waited. My father did. The silence that followed felt heavier than applause. Because everyone understood. The field mattered. The science mattered. The data mattered. But none of it would have mattered if someone had refused to listen. Several moments later the audience stood, not all at once, gradually, until the entire room was on its feet. Malcolm remained seated, at first. Then Evelyn touched his arm. He stood slowly. His eyes looked suspiciously wet. The applause continued. Andre smiled. Not proudly, not triumphantly, just gratefully, as if the weight he had carried for 2 years had finally become lighter. That winter the first meaningful rain arrived. Not a storm, not a miracle. Just rain, steady, patient, enough. Water soaked into the recovering soil. The restored field absorbed it like a sponge. Exactly as Andre had predicted. One evening Malcolm stood alone beside the 30 acres. The sky glowed orange beyond the horizon. The drought was over. The farm was safe. The future remained uncertain, as it always would. But something important had changed. He looked across the field. Then down at the soil. The same soil his father had worked. The same soil his grandfather had worked. The same soil his son had protected. For a long moment he simply stood there, listening. Because after 60 years of farming he finally understood something. The land had been talking all along. The real challenge was learning when to stop talking long enough to hear it. Years later, visitors would still ask about the famous 30 acres. Andre always gave the same answer. It wasn't empty. People usually looked confused. Then he smiled. It was busy healing. Disclaimer and personal reflection. This story is a fictional narrative inspired by real agricultural principles, soil conservation practices, and the challenges faced by farming communities across America. The characters and specific events were created for storytelling purposes, but the concepts of risk management, soil health, long-term thinking, and intergenerational learning are very real. One reason I wanted to tell this story is because modern life often rewards speed, certainty, and immediate results. Yet many of the most important things in life, whether relationships, knowledge, health, or even the land beneath our feet, require patience before they reveal their value. Sometimes wisdom is not found in doing more. Sometimes wisdom is found in knowing what needs time to heal.